Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Asian Vision Dialogue. Today, the main theme of our discussion is about the ASEAN Chairmanship 2024. We focus on Laos, set up to enhance the connectivity and resilience. And I have the honor and pleasure to have our guest speaker, Dr. Digby Rens. He is a special advisor to the Institute of International Relations of Cambodia at the Royal Academy of Cambodia. And without further delay, please join me in welcoming Dr. Ren to our program.
Thank you very much,
Yes,
It's a great pleasure to join you again.
Yes, thanks so much for taking your time joining us again.
Oh, it's my pleasure, really.
All right. So now we comes to another new topic that talking about the ASEAN under Laos PDL Chairmanship in 2024. So before we jump into the main points of our topic on Laos PDL, I would like to ask you a little bit on the achievement that Indonesia as a ASEAN chair last year. But how did ASEAN Indonesia made an achievement toward the ASEAN community building processes? Yeah.
Well, that's a complex question actually, because Cambodia held the ASEAN chair the year before,
yes.
so 2022,
Yep.
and did a really good job, but was confronted with two major challenges, which was Myanmar was one of those challenges and COVID was the other. So Indonesia was kind of lucky, if you like, that when it inherited the next chairmanship, the next round, the Myanmar question had been sort of calmed somewhat. It's not like super active, and COVID, of course, we're on the back end of COVID.
Yeah.
So Indonesia was sort of fortunate in that. But look, I mean, the hats off to Cambodia the year before for handing over to Indonesia a relatively robust agenda where, COVID, we'd done very well basically over COVID. ASEAN had handled that pretty well together. But then that handover from Cambodia to Indonesia gave Indonesia a lot of headaches as well. And those headaches were mostly related to geopolitics and US-China. Well, it's framed as US-China rivalry, but it's really more US discontent with China's growing influence than it is really about rivalry. Because the Chinese position has always been to look for consensus. So Indonesia, one of the first things they did was come out and say, and I was involved in actually the Indonesian ASEAN chairmanship. They have a special committee and they came and visited us and sat down with us and asked us what we thought was going to happen. So we talked about quite a few things, but interestingly the Indonesians really took that to heart, or maybe we just had seen the same things that other people had seen. So connectivity is number one. That has always been the big plan in ASEAN. ASEAN connectivity plan is 2025, which is only another year away. So that's the role that Laos is going to get. And Indonesia, Joko Widodo, off the back of COVID, but he still had to concentrate on that. And I think the Indonesians did quite a good job actually with that. That really was quite smooth. And I think everybody was on board. And internationally as well, so it kind of worked okay in their favour. The connectivity thing, but that's always being moved forward, and we can see that Laos has taken that as well, and connectivity more. But when we talk about connectivity, we're talking about any kind of connectivity, right? Fibre optic, digital, roads, rail, pipelines, electricity transmission, things like that. And that becomes very, very important when you think about Laos. But yeah, Indonesia followed that, of course, and the big one for Indonesia was digital. They really pushed the digital connectivity, and we can see that Indonesia's been, under Widodo, has been reforming their economy to push towards more and more digital, but they've also been very careful to protect local and ASEAN development, startups, any sort of local-based corporation or company or technology. They've given that preference, which some other countries were not too happy about. And they also said that they would like to push forward the code of conduct on the South China Sea, and they really tried to do that. But and I think you can see that the Philippines, the activity between the US and the Philippines has been destabilizing that code of conduct arrangement. One has to imagine it's deliberate. So that's still a struggle. So they weren't able to make much forward movement on that. But look, Indonesia didn't really focus on norms and values. They concentrated on more pragmatic things related to economy and connectivity and cross-border transactions and harmonization, all of those things which fit very nicely with all the ASEAN plans. So, look, Indonesia is the largest, most powerful country in ASEAN, and what it does really sets the agenda no matter what. So look, the Indonesians kept a very steady ship. They told the Americans very strongly that they didn't want, ASEAN is set up to stop great power interference within the 10 Southeast Asian countries. And Widodo was quite erudite, quite strict about that. He really said, we're going to do that, and this rivalry is not helping us. And so try to avoid that as much as he can, but obviously the Philippines has changed that equation slightly. So that was actually quite good. And I think we've seen that the economy across ASEAN, 5.5% GDP growth.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that Indonesia generated, but that's a very good sign. And so they're operating within a surplus environment, a growth environment, whereas, some of their biggest trading partners in the north are not, the US and the EU. That's problematic for them. So I think, it's obvious that Indonesia wanted to protect the arrangement between ASEAN and China as much as possible, but try to include more and more Indo-Pacific members, Korea, Japan, and some others, and even the Pacific Islands, try and pull them in closer to a sort of an ASEAN view. I think the Japanese are quite open to that. I think the Koreans are quite open to that. But we can see with the activities that were going on with Myanmar and the Philippines, Indonesia had a hard time for that.
Yeah.
But the Bandung Railway, for example, high-speed rail between Jakarta and successfully at the G20, right? And the G20 was also held in Indonesia, but that was not so successful, I think, and it's become fairly clear now that there are very differing interests inside the G20, and the G7 no longer really controls the G20. And they're trying to politicize the G20 to push it towards more political and away from economic. And it was set up for economy, right, after 2008. So that's probably a mistake. I think the G20 not going to, that's lost a lot of influence, let's say. I think that's influence-wise, it's less and less. And the BRICS is much, much more. And I think Indonesia is probably going there as well. And that was sort of an outcome of their arrangements with ASEAN as well. They were looking at BRICS. And so you can see that there's a real affinity in there actually for these kind of blocks like ASEAN, African Union, Gulf Cooperation Council, to operate, to work together and move a little bit away from these sort of G7, G20, G8, and operate more in these new arrangements with BRICS, ASEAN, China, +1, +2, +3, all that stuff. So Indonesia handled it quite well, I think, and they've given Laos, which is a very small country in real terms, a fairly clean plate.
Yes, I see. Yes,
to operate on.
Yes. All right, thank you.
It's a long answer, sorry.
Right, that's very insightful. I think when we look back to the Indonesia chairmanship, it's like, there are like kinds of achievement and some challenges that Indonesia has deal with and still need to handle to Laos as well.
Yeah, that's right.
With the current themes of Laos that they set the theme of enhancing connectivity and resilience. So do you think this theme can deal with the current situation in ASEAN and whether Laos can handle this or not?
ASEAN integration and ASEAN centrality go hand in hand. And although lip service is given to ASEAN centrality by Australia and the Americans and the Europeans, at a real political level, they're actually inserting pressure that is destabilizing ASEAN, not stabilizing ASEAN. So I think, you know, the most pessimistic of my colleagues would say that it's deliberate. The Americans are specifically trying to split ASEAN between maritime and mainland, if you like. So the maritime states, Indonesia, Singapore, Brunei, and everybody on the water, so to speak, and then the land base, so Myanmar, Cambodia, Laos. So Vietnam is maritime, right?
Yeah.
Malaysia is also maritime, but mostly mainland. Thailand's mostly mainland. So like that, and so the Americans seem to be trying to split. That's the real fear inside ASEAN. So of course, integration. And integration is most effectively done by better connectivity. And I think in a previous answer I might have said that, you know, that connectivity is what we're talking about here is all connectivities. So there's substructure, right? And this is very important to Laos because it's landlocked. And for the very first time, it's got a railway link externally from its capital to another country, high-speed rail. So it has more high-speed rail than the United States. It's got one line, right? But I asked a friend yesterday, I found yesterday somebody who'd been on it, so it was just fabulous, wonderful. Worked perfectly, they were at 200 k's an hour and smooth as, and it was beautiful. And so that's part of the connectivity, isn't it? The ASEAN plan, 2025, 2030, they're all about connectivity for transport. So airlines, trains, ships, cars, so forth. And then it's all about digital. And that's the main focus from Indonesia. So obviously fiber optic, transmission, data centers, but harmonization of all of these things. You know, how does this work cross-border transactions, taxes, customs? That all has to be harmonized. Very, very complicated. And then there's the section of resilience, right? So the influence of China and then resilience as well. And resilience, of course, is the ability for those infrastructures to operate despite external pressures. To integrate ASEAN more so that its economy is more protected from external influences and greater cross-border flexibility internally, and then operating more flexibly as a bloc externally. And that will mean that they can offset external influence much, much more. And I think that is still the greatest danger, is external influence. But for Laos is in a particularly interesting point because it's actually a sort of a hub now, especially for hydropower and the transmission lines in Asia. And that's only going to grow. Besides, people are not happy about dams, but most of the dams in Laos they're not Chinese dams, they're Thai or Vietnamese dams. It's a very big misconception that I hear all the time is people say, oh, well, all those Chinese dams, I go, I'm terribly sorry, but they're not actually Chinese, they're Thai or Vietnamese dams, most of them. Yes, there is one or two Chinese, but the rest are all Thai and Vietnamese. So that's within the ASEAN connectivity of structure, you see. And Cambodia also shares a little bit that role because it's not landlocked, but it's kind of between the bigger regional powers. And so connectivity is so much more important. So, for example, Laos and Cambodia are not connected very well. So that's a big thing to try and do. So Laos would have access to the Gulf of Thailand, for example, or access to the coast of Vietnam, for example, up into China and so forth. So that's very, very important, that connectivity. And then the resilience part is, so COVID-19, energy shortages, food security, all of those things and those steps. I think they're already all in process. The thing is, Laos has to just got to keep them moving, and that's okay. But for Laos, I think the number one thing is going to be the improved connectivity, because the Lao economy is not strong. And they have a terrible problem with their currency, the kip. That's been very, very difficult. And so far, okay. So they've been able to balance it, but they've needed a lot of help from other ASEAN partners and from China to do that, but also from Japan and others, and Vietnam even. But I think going forward, those are very good themes for Laos to choose, really. Suits them well.
Okay, yes. Thank you, Doctor. I think that's really important to know the themes of Laos, and also we can see that Laos prioritize more likely to the economic connectivity and kinds of economic recovery and kind of thing
Sure, that's right. And that's going to be taken under certain areas, right, where they're looking for these harmonizations that are going to help Laos. But the first thing, of course, is really make sure that there's connectivity. Laos is still very poorly connected. So that's really prime for them. It has to be done. But those networks are really growing very quickly right now. I think, people don't realize that within the next 5 years, the highway structure and the rail structure, in terms of freight, not necessarily people, but freight, goods and services, that's going to be much better than it is now. There's highways and airports and rail lines all being built right now that are going to connect all of this up. So that's a really important thing. But there's going to be lots of agreements related to services as well, including ocean services, mountains, woods, things that electric vehicles, all these sorts of things have all got to be done. E-commerce, rules governing e-commerce. Opening up the markets. So, for example, in half of ASEAN, everybody's got Facebook, but in some other parts, it's other software. They're using Telegram and WeChat and things like that. And there's payment systems within there, Alipay and so forth. They all have to be integrated. That they work also with MasterCard and Visa and everything. You see, but there's still this kind of idea that you can split these things, and nobody's allowed to switch. You see. You're not allowed to switch from Visa and MasterCard and Facebook and then suddenly start using Alipay and something else and Grab. You see, there's this kind of... So that is part of this idea of resilience and connectivity, is making sure that all of the systems and platforms are operating on a level playing field. And that ASEAN itself is producing its own technology. That's always been a problem. So I think those are big moves, and if Laos can do something about that, that's great. But, one has to remember that Laos is a very small country.
Okay, yeah. Thank you, Doctor. It's more about digital economy from Laos.
Yeah, I think that's going to be big. And that connectivity, but also road, rail, all that stuff. Laos has not been the huge beneficiary other than the Chinese high speed from Kunming, which is working very well for them, of course, because that's transporting goods and services. So extending that is so important for all of ASEAN, but especially for Laos because it's landlocked.
All right, yes. So interestingly, if we look back at another perspective of geopolitical and geo-economic challenges, so can you foresee the challenges of Laos during its chairmanship?
Well, Laos is already in a kind of a slightly difficult position because basically China and Vietnam are kind of competing for influence all the time in Laos, and obviously China's so large, and they're building railways and they're buying lots of products. But the Vietnamese also want to have some kind of say in there. They get their electricity from Laos, so that they want to make sure it's also really, really stable. But they don't want it to just the Vietnamese fear is that Laos will become possibly working contrary to Vietnam's interests, especially as it sort of aligns closer and closer to the Americans. So that's problematic, and the Chinese don't like that, right? So there you see that kind of rivalry happening. It's pretty small scale in Laos, but it's happening. So that needs to be done very, very carefully. But Laos has all those big fundamental problems of education and health services and things like that. So all of this is designed to give them a platform to show what they've been able to do and what they've already done and what they can do further to integrate into ASEAN. But there are huge problems. I think currency is still a really massive problem, not just for them, but for everybody, for Cambodia too. And getting the currency exchange, local currency payments on cross-border transactions, right? Not switching into dollars or switching into yuan or switching into another currency, or using credit through American banks, for example, where interest rates are going up. So that sort of thing, they've got to try and kind of configure more independence in relation to financial services. That's going to be key. And that will help protect economies like Laos. It's so susceptible to US interest rates and loans that were made through development banks a long time ago, which, they're still paying principal. Still paying the interest and not principal. This is a real problem too. It's kind of a debt trap, if you like, that they're stuck in, and how to get out of that. So, in the Chinese view, we'll help you build infrastructure, you'll make more money, you'll trade more, and you'll be able to pay your debts. In the American view, you should just pay your debts and not get any more debt. And no roads and railways, just pay your debts. Because clearly we can see that the Europeans and the Americans and the Japanese are not building railways in Laos, right? And they're not building schools and hospitals, not on a large scale. So Laos has to really be careful about that and say, well, we need to have a more ASEAN-focused development path, not be so dependent on the Americans or the Europeans. Still do lots of trade, but you see, Laos, what does it export? It has almost zero processing. So that's another thing, getting processing into Laos. Up near there, they have lots and lots of resources. Minerals, gold, food, you name it. They've got it.
Yes. Yes.
So how to get it processed and then distributed and get that system working, that's a real challenge.
Okay.
And I think the other one that I was going to talk about, and the challenge was the Indo-Pacific.
Yeah.
Like outlook on Indo-Pacific and how difficult it is, because everybody's being forced into having to take a position on the American position. And so the ASEAN position is fairly neutral, really. It's not like a full endorsement or anything. And ASEAN can't fully endorse it, it's not possible. ASEAN has to have its own distinct view, and that's what it's tried to put forward, but at the same time trying to keep the Americans and the Chinese and the Japanese happy. It's very difficult. Yeah.
Okay, yes. So that it's important to note some challenges during Laos chairmanship.
There's a lot of challenges.
There's a lot of things.
Yeah. Well, Myanmar is another challenge.
Sure, yes, yeah.
And that's very, very poorly understood. Myanmar is very, very poorly understood, both within ASEAN and outside ASEAN. And so Laos has a real interest here because of the Golden Triangle. And so all of the drug, human trafficking, arms trafficking, gold trafficking, all sorts of means by which people try to generate money illegally for whatever purpose, because the purpose is not always just crime. Sometimes it's other things, terrorism, armed struggle, insurrection, sedition, all those sorts of things going on in Myanmar. And I think people don't realise that Myanmar has been perpetually in civil war, basically, for 70 years. So how could you expect their government to not be military? If you're constantly at war, then you're going to become that. So just saying they should have a civil government ignores the reality of Myanmar's situation. And India is very, very involved in there, and that's never publicised. In fact, India is the largest arms supplier to Myanmar, and they're also the largest investor in digital. So it's so interesting.
Yeah.
But this is never publicised, you see. Everybody just assumes that it's China, but it's not. It's actually India. So India and China actually working together with Myanmar, they want to keep it stable, which gives you the third possibility that there's other external forces providing money, training, weapons to all these insurgents groups, which keeps the government as a military government. This is not just because they're evil men and they just want to hold power. They're in a political context. And that context is understood more in ASEAN. But in the media, of course, it's just brushed over as if it's all the military's fault and they're all evil and ASEAN should squash them and all that stuff. It's a manipulation. Myanmar's situation is very, very specific. It has nothing, it's not really related to ASEAN in a real sense. Connectivity, economic and everything. In that way, no. The problem is a geopolitical problem with external influence in Myanmar. It's a swing state, if you like, or a transit state, and it's going to stay like that. And so that's going to be an ongoing problem to stabilise the country. But the idea that they're going to switch away to some perfectly democratic model and so forth is very highly unlikely. And so then it suffers the idea that external influences want to keep ASEAN centrality not too strong. So making this Myanmar problem is part of that. South China Sea is part of that. Whereas ASEAN, wants to keep everybody happy, balanced, but it still has to solve these problems, right? So, but I do believe that that's all pretty well in the process of negotiation, diplomacy, pretty well done or in motion. And it's only the external powers that are really causing any problem with this. And they're not really helping, shall we say. Sanctions and all that sort of stuff doesn't help.
All right. Yes. Thank you, Doctor, for sharing your analysis on that.
Thank you.
It's very insightful. So I think we would come to the last question for
Okay.
our topic now.
Yeah.
Just want to know what are the expectations for ASEAN Summit and related event to be hosted by Laos in 2024, and how will this gathering contribute to the region progress and prosperity? Yes.
Yeah, Srinu, just to wrap up a very long answer, I'm sorry I gave you such a long answer. But look, the Laos, the choice of connectivity and resilience, I think, is neutral. In political sense, that's fairly neutral.
Yes.
And connectivity is the major push for the integration of ASEAN and the strengthening of centrality. That has got to be number one. And especially in the geopolitical balance that we have now. And we will consistently see non-ASEAN press, media, especially Anglo-American media, pointing out all the faults of ASEAN, Myanmar and the South China Sea, and China's dangerous, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But fundamentally, that's mostly noise. And the reality is that ASEAN has to be responsible and have a strategic autonomy of its own. And the Americans don't like that, but the Chinese do. The Chinese like it because it protects their southern part of all of China. It protects them and it gives them their largest trading partner. So ASEAN solidarity for China is a definite must. It's protective and it's profitable and prosperity and all of that. And it goes towards their kind of keeping other powers out of the area. Not India, because India, I think, historically, they're really important, and I'd like to see more India-China cooperation in Southeast Asia. That would be great, and a little bit less of interference from others, specifically the Americans. So that's sort of wrap up, and the resilience part is obvious, COVID and all that sort of thing. Financial. It's a real problem for Laos, so they've got to get that financial stuff, have some kind of a fund that support. They do already actually, but more active to be able to help ASEAN countries, especially if we're going towards sort of negative conditions in the global economy. That's really, really important. That's all a plus, but there's significant challenges going forward. None of these conflicts that are emerging, Ukraine, Israel, Gaza, in Africa, and so, that's all problematic. ASEAN doesn't have conflict, but I think if ASEAN was to fall into the same position that the Europeans did, vis-a-vis America and American influence, there's a very real risk of conflict in ASEAN.
Right.
And yeah, so the number one thing for all of the ASEAN countries, and it must be for Indonesia especially, and Laos can sort of help this, is to make sure that Asian centrality is strengthened.
Yes.
That is an absolute must. And if it's not, then ASEAN's future will not be so prosperous. And right now we can see it's successful, so let's keep going. Right?
Yes.
But it's always easier said than done, right? But look, I think this Laos chairmanship is a really good opportunity where they're just going to focus on the most of things related to ASEAN centrality and ASEAN prosperity, and that in itself is enough to strengthen the centrality itself. Do you see what I mean? Okay. Yeah. So that's a good thing, and
all right. Yes.
basically where we're at.
Okay. Thank you so much, Dr. Ren, for sharing your insights on this important topic today. So I think we come to the end of our dialogue today. So once again, thanks for participating today and also share your kinds of insight on this. So I look forward to having you again in the next episode.
Oh, it would be my pleasure.
Yes,
thank you very much.
Yes. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, Asian Vision Dialogue has now come to an end. Thank you for tuning in. Have a great day.